Is the US going to launch a strike on Cuba by December 31st? Prediction markets say there's a 40% chance of this happening at the time of the filming. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through my analysis, the puts and the takes, and where I land. First, we have to precisely define what we're forecasting. The question in the prediction market states US initiated drone, missile, or airstrike on the soil of Cuba must be announced or credibly reported to have occurred by December 31st, and there are 6 months left for this. It's important to note that something could be announced or credibly reported and not have actually happened, and there are instances of this happening, but it's highly unlikely, so I won't give credence to it. It also needs to be confirmed by the second day after the resolution time. If it was reported after, even if the strike happened within the allocated time, it wouldn't count. I'm not too concerned because 1, it's typically reported within minutes to hours. 2, the US president is legally required to submit within 48 hours of introducing armed forces. And 3, while it could be much longer for classified operations, I don't see that being the case here as it's highly publicized. The US has accused Cuba of posing a national security threat. It's been hit with an oil blockade, sanctions, and a murder indictment against former leader Raul Castro. The US has claimed that Cuba has alliances with foreign adversaries, ties to sponsors of terror like Iran, and is spreading communism. The US seeks resignation of leadership, democratic reforms, dismantling of the single party in favor of democratic governance, and removal of foreign adversary military and intelligence operations. Axios reported that Cuba possessed 300 drones. This they've acknowledged, but they have denied the additional claim that they were discussing strikes near US targets such as Guantanamo Bay, Key West in Florida, and naval vessels. It's natural to think every instance is unique, but it's helpful to contextualize against how often a similar instance has occurred. So far, Cuba is deemed a threat officially and faces severe sanctions. Over the past 100 years, I looked at the amount of times the US officially claimed another country posed a threat, followed up with sanctions, and within those instances, how often they conducted strikes. This suggests 40 to 50% odds and 30% of including attacks against militants, assuming the group is separate from the government. And on average, that brings us to 37%. In cases where a strike does happen, it's almost always occurred within the year of the announced threat. That means that if this is going to happen, the December 31st time limit does not reduce odds. And then what's the track record so far? The US has conducted strikes against Venezuela and Iran. There were some threats against Greenland, but nothing happened. And there were also threats against Panama, but this was resolved. So it's 50-50 so far. The former 2 presented more obvious threats, but the imminence wasn't so clear, and Cuba is more akin to these examples. Now, is there anything else to gain from this? Venezuela offered massive oil reserves, and there was external pressure regarding Iran. There isn't much of either with Cuba, aside from the Cuban diaspora wanting military action and large nickel and cobalt reserves. So it's something, but it's not as compelling. Now, what's the actual goal of the administration? They seem to want to just get rid of the communist government, which doesn't seem possible to do with just negotiations. Could Cuba be taken without military action? Maybe. It could fall on its own. Fuel shortages have led to one of the worst economic and energy crises in decades, and the threat of an invasion, paired with the economic sanctions, could be sufficient, as it was in Haiti in 1991. But that was against the government that had just gotten into power versus one that has been there for 70 years, so it's not the same, and I would discount that outcome. Conversely, the elite have continued to maintain their form of life to an extent, and the issue more so affects the Cuban public. Past protests haven't led to change, and if they haven't caved by now with their people suffering, why would a little bit more time change that? The people have had a history of enduring hardship. If anything, an increasingly dire situation could lead to people fleeing, at which point it becomes a refugee crisis, and that's worse for the US. They may also keep getting aid from other countries. What about the possibility that Cuba attacks first? I don't see the logic in this claim, despite the claims that they've discussed striking nearby US targets. These are low-value targets, they don't advance their cause because they have no ability to follow through, and it would only make a case for US intervention stronger. While this doesn't raise the odds, it also doesn't decrease it because the prior considerations were not reliant on this as a qualifier. If they presented a legitimate future threat, that could present a case for intervention. I think odds are they don't pose a pressing threat given it hadn't been brought up in other contexts pre-Trump. I don't doubt that adversaries run intelligence operations from there, which is a threat, but it's also not much different from the US having intelligence operations in Taiwan, Japan, Ukraine, etc. And if Obama and Biden were both pursuing paths to normalization, I think it's unlikely that both of them were completely neglecting legitimate threats to the nation. If it's not an imminent threat, then perhaps the odds of a strike by December 31st are lower. We also need to ask ourselves if airstrikes are enough to achieve the stated goals. If they're not, are they willing to follow through if greater intervention is needed? On one hand, they could take out the leaders. If the remainder aren't strong-willed, they then may be open to stepping down and having a democratically elected leader take over so long as they don't go to jail and can live normal lives. In this scenario, the US doesn't need to establish direct control at all. Shock and awe would suffice. They could also specifically target weapons capabilities such as 300 drones in their possession to improve the negotiating position. On the other hand, if you attack their leaders and the remainder do not feel there's a world where they can maintain some of their existing power and privilege, they may fight back using their confirmed weapons supply. After all, Cuba is only 90 miles from the border, and the 300 drones are hidden in strategic locations across the island. They may also get more shipments in the coming months. Drones are difficult to counter, and an attack on US soil would warrant a ground invasion for which there isn't political appetite for. Leadership also directly controls the Cuban economy, so military action could put the country in disarray and trigger a refugee crisis for which there also isn't political appetite and may require boots on the ground to secure and establish control. How about the Iran conflict? Does that change anything? On one hand, people don't expect it'll happen so close to just coming out of the Iran conflict, making it perhaps the right time for there to be a surprise attack. The public hasn't cared much for attacks as long as they're short and effective, Venezuela being an example. Despite the noise, I do think both parties in that conflict want to move on, and I think things will normalize. On the other hand, the public has clearly demonstrated distaste for new wars. With Trump saying we were near Armageddon in 4 weeks with oil reserves running out, I don't think there's appetite near term to pursue a conflict on another front, at least until the midterms. But it may be pursued afterwards. This leads us to midterm outcomes. All House seats are up for grabs, and 1/3 of the Senate. In my view, Democrats will win the House, and they'll make gains in the Senate, but they won't win a majority. But let's say they win both. It hasn't changed much. Without a 2/3 majority, they can't stop the strikes, but they could make a full invasion more difficult. Ultimately, I don't think the way the midterm goes affects whether they will or won't strike. Finally, are there any diplomatic solutions on the table? Cuba said that they will not negotiate on their domestic political system, nor will they accept US-mandated regime change. At the same time, they recently announced economic reforms that are attracting investment and are evaluating measures related to foreign trade and eliminating mandatory state intermediaries in import and export operations. I think progress on this front offers an easy win that the administration can point to, similar to the concessions that Panama offered to resolve tensions with the US, thereby reducing the odds of military action. So the final probability is 31%. Now that you know the variables, let me know in the comments below whether you agree or disagree. If your analysis suggests that there's a healthy spread between your probability and where the market's at, maybe it's worthwhile. You may be wrong in this instance, but if you're consistently making well-calibrated predictions, the spread should make you money over time. But remember that markets are smart, and consistently beating them is extremely difficult, so please proceed with caution. And ultimately, this is for educational purposes and isn't advice. Thanks for watching.